The coffee cup trembled in Maria Santos's weathered hands as she watched the flashing red and blue lights slice through the pre-dawn darkness outside Pete's all-night diner. At 53, she'd seen enough late-night drama to know when trouble was brewing, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold in the next 24 hours, a sequence of events that would transform her quiet corner of small-town America into the epicenter of an extraordinary story about courage, compassion, and the unexpected bonds that unite us all. The bell above the diner door chimed with unusual urgency as two police officers burst in, their hands resting ominously on their holsters. Behind them, the parking lot buzzed with activity. 3 squad cars, their radios crackling with static-filled chatter. Maria had been refilling the sugar dispensers, preparing for the breakfast rush still hours away when the commotion began. Now, as she stood frozen behind the counter, her mind raced through the possibilities of what could bring such a heavy police presence to her peaceful establishment. "We're looking for a suspect," Officer Bradley announced, his voice cutting through the diner's usual hum of refrigeration and the distant sizzle of the grill. "Male, mid-40s, wearing a leather jacket. Riding a Harley-Davidson. We have reason to believe he's armed and dangerous." Maria's eyes instinctively drifted to booth 7 in the far corner, where a lone customer sat hunched over a steaming cup of coffee and a half-eaten slice of apple pie. Jake Morrison had been coming to Pete's for nearly 3 months now, always ordering the same thing, always sitting in the same booth, always leaving a generous tip despite his worn clothing and the careful way he counted his money. His leather jacket bore the colors of a motorcycle club she didn't recognize, but his gentle manner with her and his soft-spoken "thank you, ma'am," after every interaction had earned him a special place in her heart. The man in question looked up as the officers scanned the diner, and Maria saw something in his eyes she'd never noticed before, not the hardened defiance she might have expected from someone the police were hunting, but a deep, weary sadness that reminded her of her own son during his darkest days, struggling with addiction. Jake's hands, she noticed, remained visible on the table, palms down, fingers spread, the posture of someone who understood how these situations could escalate. "That's him," Officer Bradley said, his hand moving to his weapon. "Sir, stand up slowly and keep your hands where we can see them." But Maria found herself moving before her mind could process the decision. Years of maternal instinct, honed by raising 3 children as a single mother, propelled her forward until she stood squarely between the officers and Jake's table. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her face, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Excuse me, officers, but what exactly has this man done?" Officer Bradley's expression hardened. "Ma'am, please step aside. This is police business." "This is my diner," Maria replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "And Jake here has been nothing but respectful every time he's come in. He sits quietly, pays his bill, and never causes trouble. So I'm asking again, what has he done?" The second officer, younger and clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension, shifted nervously. "There was a robbery 3 towns over. The suspect was described as riding a motorcycle and wearing club colors." Maria's laugh was sharp and incredulous. "A robbery? Do you see this man, officers? He's been sitting in that booth for the past 4 hours, nursing the same cup of coffee and making a slice of pie last half the night. I've served him personally. He never left his seat." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake started to speak, probably to diffuse the situation, but Maria held up her hand without taking her eyes off the officers. She'd raised 3 kids in this town, served coffee to half the population at one time or another, and she knew something about reading people. More importantly, she knew something about standing up for what was right, even when it was scary. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "even if there was a robbery 3 towns over, that doesn't give you the right to harass every person who happens to own a motorcycle. This is America, and last I checked, wearing a leather jacket wasn't a crime." Officer Bradley's radio crackled to life, and Maria caught fragments of the transmission. "Suspect apprehended, white male, age 28, no motorcycle involved." The officer's face flushed red as he listened, and Maria watched the certainty drain from his posture. "Ma'am," the younger officer said quietly, "we apologize for the disruption. We were acting on incomplete information." As the police filed out, their earlier swagger replaced by obvious embarrassment, Maria felt her knees begin to shake. Only now did she realize the magnitude of what she'd just done. Standing up to armed police officers based on nothing more than her gut instinct about a customer she barely knew. She sank into the booth across from Jake, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why?" he asked simply. Maria considered the question. Really considered it. Why had she risked her business, possibly her safety, for a man she knew so little about? "Because," she said finally, "everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. You've shown me nothing but kindness, and kindness deserves kindness in return." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've been coming here because it's the only place in town where people don't cross the street when they see me coming. You have no idea what that means to someone like me." "Someone like you?" Maria raised an eyebrow. "I made mistakes," Jake said simply. "Served time for them too. Been trying to put my life back together piece by piece. But it's hard when everyone assumes the worst based on how you look." He gestured to his leather jacket, his weathered face, the tattoos visible on his forearms. "Tonight you looked at me and saw a person worth defending. That's not something I'm used to." Maria reached across the table and patted his hand briefly. "Well, you better get used to it. You're welcome here any time." The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical for late October in their small Iowa town. Maria opened the diner at 6 a.m. as usual, going through her routine of starting the coffee, firing up the grill, and checking that everything was in its proper place. She was humming softly to herself, already putting the previous night's drama behind her, when she heard it, a low rumble in the distance, growing steadily louder. By the time she looked out the window, her hands had instinctively moved to her mouth in shock. Motorcycles filled the street as far as she could see, dozens upon dozens of them, their riders dismounting and walking purposefully toward her diner. Leather jackets bearing club colors from all over the Midwest. Bandanas, boots, and chains. It looked like something out of a movie. Except this was her quiet little restaurant on Main Street. The lead rider, a mountain of a man with a graying beard and arms like tree trunks, pushed through the door first. Maria's heart hammered as she tried to process what was happening, her mind immediately jumping to protection money, territory disputes, all the dark stories she'd heard about motorcycle clubs. But then the big man smiled, actually smiled, and removed his sunglasses. "You Maria?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for such an intimidating figure. "Yes," she managed to whisper. "Name's Rex. I'm Jake's brother. Well, not blood brother, but we've been riding together for 15 years. He gestured toward the growing crowd of bikers filing into her diner, filling every booth and lining up along the counter. "Word travels fast in our community. What you did last night, standing up for Jake when those cops tried to railroad him, that means something to us." Maria looked around at the sea of leather and denim, at faces that seemed carved from stone, but eyes that held unexpected warmth. I just did what anyone would do." Rex shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Most people would have stepped aside, minded their own business. You put yourself on the line for one of ours when you didn't have to, when it could have cost you." Another biker, this one a woman with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, stepped forward. "We're not here to cause trouble," she said with a slight southern accent. "We're here to say thank you, and to give you some business." What followed was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. 200 bikers had descended on her tiny diner, and instead of chaos, there was an almost reverent atmosphere. They were polite to the point of formality, saying please and thank you with every order, leaving their tables immaculate and tipping extravagantly. Stories began to emerge as the morning wore on, stories of second chances, of judgment and redemption, of a community that took care of its own. Jake arrived around 10, stopping short when he saw the parking lot full of motorcycles. When he walked through the door and saw the gathered crowd, tears actually formed in his eyes. Rex stood up from the counter and embraced him in a bear hug that spoke volumes about the bonds these men shared. Had to come pay our respects to the lady who's got your back. Rex explained loudly enough for everyone to hear, and to make sure she knows she's got ours too. Maria found herself pulled into conversations throughout the morning, hearing fragments of lives that had been written off by society but found meaning and brotherhood within this unlikely family. There was Danny, a former addict who'd been clean for 6 years and now ran a halfway house in Des Moines. Sarah, the silver-haired woman who had left an abusive marriage and found freedom on the road. Tom, who worked construction all week and spent weekends volunteering at veterans' shelters. By noon, word had spread through town, and Maria noticed some of her regular customers hovering uncertainly outside. Unsure whether to enter, Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday for her coffee in Danish, stood on the sidewalk peering through the windows with obvious apprehension. Without hesitation, Rex noticed the situation and stood up. "Attention, everyone," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the diner. "Looks like we've got some regular customers outside who might be feeling a little intimidated. Let's make some room and show them what hospitality looks like." The bikers immediately began consolidating, sharing tables and booths, making space and greeting Maria's regular customers with genuine warmth. Mrs. Henderson, still nervous but curious, found herself seated next to Danny, who helped her with her crossword puzzle and shared stories about his grandmother who had looked exactly like her. By the time she left, she was laughing and had exchanged phone numbers with 3 people she never would have spoken to under other circumstances. The afternoon brought reporters from the local newspaper and even a crew from the regional television station. Maria found herself thrust into a spotlight she'd never wanted, trying to explain to journalists why she'd defended Jake, why she'd risked everything for a near stranger. But the more she talked, the more she realized the answer was simpler than anyone was making it out to be. "It wasn't about being brave," she told the TV reporter as cameras rolled and bikers listened from the background. "It was about being human. We live in a world where people are so quick to judge, so ready to assume the worst about each other. But if we all just took a moment to see the person behind the appearance, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, maybe we'd realize we're not so different after all." As evening approached and the bikers began preparing to leave, Rex approached Maria one last time. In his massive hands was an envelope thick with cash. "This isn't charity," he said firmly before she could protest. "This is payment for services rendered plus a tip. You fed our people, you treated them with respect, and you showed more courage in 5 minutes than most people show in a lifetime. This diner is under our protection now, which means if you ever need anything at all, you call." He handed her a business card with a phone number written in careful block letters. Jake was the last to leave, lingering as the others fired up their engines and began pulling out of the parking lot. "Maria," he said quietly, "I want you to know I'm going back to school. Community college, to study social work. What you did last night, the way you saw something worth defending in me, it reminded me that I'm worth defending, that I can be better than my past." Tears blurred Maria's vision as she watched him walk to his motorcycle. As the last bike disappeared down Main Street, she stood alone in her diner, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the lingering scent of leather and chrome. The register was fuller than it had been in months, but more than that, her heart felt full too. The story made national news within a week. Waitress stands up to police, gets surprising support from 200 bikers, ran in newspapers across the country. Talk show producers called, wanting to fly her out for interviews. A publisher offered her a book deal, but Maria politely declined them all. She had no interest in fame or fortune. She had everything she needed right here in her little diner on Main Street. 6 months later, Jake graduated from community college with honors and was accepted into a 4-year social work program, with a full scholarship funded by an anonymous benefactor. Mrs. Henderson had become friends with several of the bikers and regularly attended their charity runs and fundraisers. And every Tuesday morning, without fail, a different group of motorcycle riders would stop by Pete's all-night diner for coffee and conversation, keeping their promise to watch over the woman who had shown them that sometimes, just sometimes, The world still had people willing to stand up for what's right. Maria never regretted that moment when she stepped between the police and Jake. In a world that often seemed divided by fear and prejudice, she had discovered something profound, that courage is contagious, that kindness multiplies, and that sometimes the smallest act of human decency can ripple outward in ways we never imagine, touching lives and changing hearts long after the moment itself has passed.